Professor, thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Hello. So, thank you again. I'm happy to be here for the third time these 3 days. So today I'm going to talk about a topic which is somewhat different from what I've been talking about recent days. It's about the euro crisis, where I see that you are a good number of people, so you are interested to understand why we are in such a bad shape in Europe. I'll try to explain what I think about it. I'm going to give you one interpretation. I'm not sure it's the interpretation of most economists, but this is, I would say, an heterodox type of interpretation. So, I will start very simply with a fact which is obvious for all of us, all Europeans in particular, that the Eurozone, which is one of the largest zone, in monetary zone in the world, in fact, but is at the same time the most depressed area of the world in terms of growth, because we have a level of zero growth approximately now. Some countries, like Germany, have a negative rate of growth in the recent, according to the recent statistics. France, we are around zero. And also, and this is even much more important, we have an extremely high rate of unemployment among countries, in particular in southern countries of Eurozone, like Spain, for instance, where you have a rate of unemployment of about 25%, and for the young, below 25 years old, 50% of the young people are unemployed, and some of them are coming in Brazil, for instance, looking for jobs, because over there in Spain and in the rest of Europe, the situation is very, very depressed. Now, my major hypothesis to interpret what's going on in the Eurozone is to say that we are suffering of major imbalances among country members, between, in particular, what we may call the core countries, like Germany, Austria, Netherlands, on one side, and peripheral countries like Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece. And we shall see later on, it's difficult to know where France stands. Maybe, I would say, in the southern countries, in fact. But there is a discussion. The French elites do not like, of course, the idea that France is now a southern country, or a peripheral country. And the main explanation for me of this very deep structural crisis is that we are suffering of what I would call internal contradictions due to the incompleteness and to the incoherent decision that have been taken with respect to the building of the Eurozone. Okay? So here we have a system which is not working correctly because of its internal contradiction. So my presentation would be in 3 times, basically 2 major parts, or let's say 4 if you include the introduction. I will just remind you, for those of you who are not aware of that, and I understand that you are not, because it's something which is specific to Europe, but it's important to remind that Europe has been integrating, very ambitious integration took place in Europe since World War II. That is about for 60 years now. And this is important to understand that, to understand the rest of the story. Then my part number 1, the most important part, would be to explain what kind of contradiction we have within this Eurozone, because these contradictions are really the major cause of this crisis we have now. I will then give you some data, some informations, showing you the big and growing imbalances between core and non-core, or if you want, peripheral countries in the Eurozone. And I will end up my presentation by presenting some scenarios for the future. Where are we going now in the future years? And some people say we are the crisis is over, and I think the contrary. I think the crisis is not over, and in fact we may have problems in the coming years, even in the coming month. So first, remember, for those of you who were here yesterday, when I talk about this process of regionalization, which is taking place in some parts of the world, here in Latin America, for instance, with the Mercosur, for instance. In Asia also, in East Asia, they have ASEAN countries getting together, trying to integrate some of their policies. Well, we can say that Europe is the part of the world, certainly, where the integration among countries, economic, political, monetary, has been pushed the furthest away, okay? So it's a progress, we can say, to some respects, although some people, and in France, extreme right parties, are using that, saying, look, it's a failure, Europe is the problem, we should go back to our frontier, national frontier. So today there is a big debate, but one thing is sure, that since 1950, we had several stages of integration which were very, very important. Don't recall that European integration was decided after World War II. It was the third war that we had in Europe. We had 1870, the First World War and the Second World War. So it was decided that we should stop fighting and we should try to integrate countries, to have a peaceful integration under the umbrella of the US. This must be said also. And also because there was this Iron Curtain, communist parties, and communist countries were there. So the idea is to integrate Western Europe together to make a stronger region to be able to resist eventually to the pressure coming from communist countries. This is the political scene that we had at that time, 60 years ago. So I won't detail all the stages we had. Just, you will have my PowerPoint if you are interested, and also you have our paper, a paper which I wrote with Robert Gutmann, a professor of Austria University, who came here a couple of times already. I'm sure a lot of you know him. So we decided to write this paper together. Okay, so recently we had or let's say 4 major steps to go to the, well, first we had in 1987, the Single Market Treaty, which is very important to understand the logic, the market-oriented logic of European integration. Then we had the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, which created the European monetary system, the monetary union, if you prefer. And then recently, after the crisis, in 2009 and then 2011, we had new treaties which decided to change the rules, to make more constrained, to make stricter rules, to force countries, in particular, to reduce the deficit, the public deficits, government deficits, which is the role of the last treaty decided, voted in 3 years ago. So this is how European integration has been developing. So you can see that there are a lot of stages, and we are in a part of the world where there is a lot of integration among our country. Now, let's go on the first real important part of my presentation, is to try to understand what contradiction we have within our European construction, within the European Union, and within the Eurozone. By the way, we have 28 countries now in the European Union, and 18 countries of them are members of the European Union. So 10 countries like UK, like Poland, Hungary, to quote the major ones, are outside the European Union, but within, outside the Eurozone, I'm sorry, but within, within the European Union and and outside the Eurozone. Thank you. Thank you. So we have here two major contradictions. One is that there is a kind of choice which should have been made and was not made really between what we call the deepening of the construction of institutions, of the what we call today the governance of Europe, in particular the political governance on one side, and the second movement, which is to some extent contradictory, what we may call the geographical widening, that is increasing the number of countries. Why? Because we went from 6 to 28 country members, from 1956 up to 2 years ago. And you can imagine that among these countries there is a lot of heterogeneity. You have very small countries, like Cyprus, just to give you an example, very big countries like Germany. You have southern countries with different cultures and different history compared to northern countries of Europe and so on. So we have a lot of heterogeneity, okay? And if we decide to broaden and to include a good number of countries, then it means that it's more difficult to have a real deepening in the institutional framework, okay? So this is the first contradiction. We tried to do both of them, but in fact it was not really possible. The other contradiction, the other element of internal contradiction, is the fact that we had two approaches which were competing with respect to the building of Europe. One is what I would call the market-oriented approach, saying, well, integration should go through market mechanism, using the market forces, okay? And this is what I would call the neoliberal approach to Europe. And you had another view, which was very important in the after-war period, which was the idea that public policies by government with coordination among countries was the most important thing to do if we want to improve the standard of living in Europe, if we want to have a higher level of development and so on, to solve such problems like energy problem, like transportation problem, and so on. So these were the two conflicting views. And in fact, if you look now what happened 60 years after the European construction started, you can say that the geographical widening was the most important dimension, and not so much the institutional framework deepening. And the second thing also, which was clearly decided, if you look at all the treaties, all the political decisions, is clearly that emphasis has been put on the market-oriented approach with this business of the single market, okay? So, for me, these two elements are really the explanation of what's going on today in Europe. And to some extent, I would say that Europe is going, when I say Europe, it's not only the Eurozone, but the European Union, the 28 countries of the European Union, are we going toward what we may call a free trade area rather than a really integrated region of the world where with common policies? This is a debate. By the way, I don't know if you are aware of European history. When the 6 first members of the European Union, like France, Germany, Italy, for instance, the Netherlands, decided to get together, the British, the UK said, no, we don't want to have a system too much integrated. We want to keep our own sovereignty, which can be understood. By the way, UK is an island. They are used to live on their side, and we can understand. But they said there's something else, which is even more important. They say we want a free trade system rather than a regional integration with common policies. And they created at that time a competing approach to the European construction, which was called the free trade area of Europe. And it was only about, let's say, 20 years later that the British came in the European Union. And some people, and I think I'm not very far from thinking that think that the British conception of Europe as one, in fact. In the sense that now we have, in Europe, we are going toward a free trade area rather than an integrated region with common policies, common public policies. Okay, so this is how it works, and according to me, both pillars of the European construction, geographical widening on one side, the market-oriented approach, are the reason why Europe is having problems today. Okay. Now, I will give you a few examples of the liberalization process in Europe. The fact that we have now a market-oriented approach. So I'm sorry if I give you too many numbers, but you look at them when you have the PowerPoint presentation. These are, some of them are in the paper, but not all of them. For instance, this is not in our paper. But here is a table where you see the process of financial liberalization and integration in Europe. And you can see very well that in all countries listed here, starting with Belgium and going up to the UK, we had a very early liberalization, financial liberalization. For instance, with respect to the lifting of capital controls, you could see that in the 90s, and even before for some countries like UK, all controls were lifted, okay? Whereas, as you know, in the Bretton Woods system, in the post-war period, we had capital controls. So in Europe, we decided very quickly to lift them in connection with the single market. The idea that we should have no barriers to the free circulation of trade, but also of capital. So we had deregulation of interest rate, deregulation of the banking system, and so on. So deregulation, financial deregulation, was a very important process in Europe, right from the 90s, I would say. And this is an indication, among others, that we are looking very much, we are oriented toward a market system rather than a system controlled by public policies. Okay? Now, there is an indicator, very interesting indicator by Shin Ito indicator of capital account finance regulation, liberalization, if you prefer, which is interesting to look at because you can see the following things. You can see that what we call the non-core countries, or if you prefer, the peripheral countries of Europe, which were not really liberalized in the 90s because this is the time when they joined the European Union, countries like Spain, Greece, Portugal, look how fast they liberalized themselves. In other words, countries which were very much under government control decided to liberalize very, very quickly within 20 years, less than that sometimes. So this is very important. In other words, if you wanted to be a member of the EU and then of the Eurozone, you had to liberalize very drastic way your financial system. This was part of the system. This is a proof that neoliberal approach to Europe was really dominant right from the beginning to some extent. Okay? Another indicator which may be interesting also to look at with respect to the financialization process in Europe, here it's the size of capital market, you know, with a ratio of capital market size compared to the GDP in percentage. Well, look what happened. This is very interesting also. You could see that non-core countries, that is peripheral countries, the one I was mentioning before, had a fairly low ratio in the 90s, and now have a higher ratio of capital markets compared to GDP, higher than core countries like Germany, like France, and so on. In other words, in Spain, for instance, the level of financialization is extremely high, much higher than it is now in France and in Germany. And this is one of the problems of these countries. As you know, Spain undergone a very difficult situation in the last years because of this very high level of financialization, much higher than, for instance, in France. For instance, the real estate market in Spain had a huge bubble, much more important than in France and Germany, for instance. And this is part of the situation. Now, In our paper with Robert Gutmann, the paper that I sent that some of you maybe already had the time to read, we focus very much on what we call measure biases within the system. In other words, the construction of the monetary union has been suffering, according to us, of course, of two major biases. One is what we call the monetarist bias, or if you prefer, the anti-Keynesian bias or philosophy. The way the European Union has been built is clearly very much inspired from the monetarist approach of money, banking, monetary policy, and so on. You could see that, for instance, by the fact that we have the most independent central bank in the world, ECB, European Central Bank. The fact that the only and primary goal of this bank was, and it still is to a large extent, inflation, fighting inflation. That it was concentrating very much on what we call hard money policy, with a view of exogenous money, okay, money being exogenous, and if you control strictly money supply, then you would have less inflation, which is, of course, for most of us who are Keynesian and post-Keynesian, this is completely incredible to have such a belief, but this was the belief of the people who decided to build, the European Union. We should have balanced budget, okay, and no bailout, and in particular, no monetization of government debt. In other words, the central bank is completely independent of government. It should not finance whatsoever the public deficits, okay? And this was part of the hard doctrine, of the Union, monetary union. And this explains why we have such a big crisis today, by the way. I will come back to that maybe in a moment, okay? And also, the idea that we should have a very strong currency, what we may call an overvalued currency. Why is it so? It's because when you have an overvalued currency, as you know, this is very good for inflation. This reduces the level of inflation because you pay your imports, let's say energy imports, for instance, in dollar, you pay them at a lower price, and hence it's good for disinflation, which was one of the major goals of the central bank and monetary policy. The second bias, which is very important for us, is what we may call the mercantilist bias, in the sense that not only market-oriented policies were gaining ground, but also the export-led strategy was really dominant. In other words, we have to push countries to go toward an export-led model. And here you see very well the contradiction. If you take a zone like the Eurozone with 18 countries doing most of the trade among them, in other words, France, for instance, is making more than 50% of its external trade with partners, country members of the Eurozone. All countries cannot be exporters, can have surpluses. This is ridiculous. So building a zone with a strong competition among the countries and pushing them to be export-led is something which is completely incoherent in terms of economic thinking. So you can see that the people who were in charge of Europe and people who were economists who designed the European system were very poor economists because they did not think that this was a big contradiction in the system. And this is why even now, Angela Merkel, for instance, at the head of Mr. Stoiber, at the head of the Ministry of Finance in Germany, these people are still saying all countries must have a trade surplus, which is completely ridiculous, should have high level of savings, should have a very low deficit, public government deficit, and so on. So here, this is the ideology, the mercantilist and neoliberal ideology, which is really at the root of the European crisis. And for us, this is the major explanation maybe of why we are in trouble. And why we are still in trouble? Because our government and a good number of economists today still think in these terms, on those terms. That this is why we have a big problem. Now, I'm going to use the very famous and also orthodox approach to European integration, the Mundell theory of optimal currency area. I'm sure most of you learned that theory, that approach, which is fairly well known. Please come in. I'm sure you have seats there. I'm very happy that you are here. Please. Pardon. So, the Mundell optimal currency area is stating that in fact a group of countries can get together to create a monetary zone with fixed exchange rate or with a common currency or a unique currency if they respect a given number of conditions, okay? Because if countries are getting together with fixed exchange rate, it means that they abandon the possibility of adjusting the exchange rate between them. So they need new or alternative adjustment mechanisms to take into account the differences between the country, the difference in growth, the difference in trade, in competitiveness, and so on. So the four major conditions which were put forward by Mundell and his other economists who've been working on this theory is the idea of having labor mobility, In other words, the workers could go from one country to the other, going from one country where there is a high level of unemployment, for instance, where to countries where the level of there is a need for workers. Wage and price flexibility, because if exchange rate is fixed, we need other prices to move, to adjust. And which are these other prices? Wage and price flexibility. By the way, you see here that we are very far from the Keynesian framework, because one of the major assumptions in the Keynesian framework, which is much more realistic than the neoclassical one, is that in Keynes' world, you have wage rigidity, price rigidity. Here we assume that in this world, we should have price and wage flexibility. And also, this is very important, we need to have fiscal transfers from the different regions of the union. In other words, is one union is in trouble, having a recession, for instance, compared to other parts of the union where the situation is fairly good, it means that the part of the union where the rate of growth is higher should transfer funds, public or private funds, towards the part of the union where we have a weaker situation. And also, recent research, recent work on the optimal currency area stress the fact that countries should have synchronized business cycles, or if you prefer, when they have a shock, for instance, a productivity shock or an oil shock coming from outside, all countries should approximately react in the same way, what we call symmetrical shock. Okay? So this is a theory, but even, so I don't like this theory, but let's take it for granted. Then, if you look at this theoretical approach, it's obvious that the Eurozone is not an optimal currency area. It's obvious. Why? It's obvious because in Europe, for instance, we have a fairly low level of labor mobility. Just one reason, among others. The cultural and linguistic barriers. We have 28 countries, or let's say 18 in Eurozone. You have approximately 15 different languages. Okay? So it's very difficult for workers, even for young workers, younger workers who learn many languages. It's for them not obvious to travel from one country, let's say for a French, for instance, engineer, to go from France to Germany, or to go from France to Poland, for instance. Okay? So, what about wage and price flexibility? Well, we have in Europe a situation where we have a lot of social control on wages. For instance, we have minimum wages in many countries. And this is a good thing. This is a progress. So this type of system, social system that we have in Europe, which is fairly developed, means that wage flexibility is not very high. And for neoliberal people, it's very bad. This is a problem. And what they always call for improving the labor market, having more flexibility and so on, but which means if we do it, that we reduce, for instance, and we eliminate sometimes minimum wage regulation, okay? What about fiscal transfers? This is maybe the most important thing. If you recall one thing, this is the most important one. If you look at other monetary union in the world, take the US, which can be taken as a monetary union, it's a federal state, but Germany can be taken as a monetary union, it's a federal state. Switzerland, it's a small country, but can be taken as a monetary union because you have different states having the same money. Look at the US, for instance. If you look at the US, you have a federal budget, which is about 20% of GDP. And the rest is by federal states. All the expenditures are made by federal states. But 20% of GDP is huge. In the Eurozone, it's 1% of GDP only, which contribute to the federal budget. In other words, we have no federal budget. Which means that, for instance, you have no money, no public money, to make fiscal transfers from one region to the other. It's impossible, okay? So here we have one of the major adjustment mechanisms which works very well in other monetary union, for instance, like the US, is completely absent in the Eurozone. And maybe this is the major problem. If we had a budget, common budget, let's say 5 or 10% of GDP, then things could have been much different. For instance, the Greek economy could have benefited from important transfers to help this economy to get out of the crisis and to develop industrial investment, to improve its productivity, and hence to become an advanced economy like Germany or like France and so on. So the problem is that we don't have such mechanisms, and this is one of the major limits. And according to neoliberal people, this is normal. We should have very low public expenditure, very low taxation at the European level, because it's against their belief. Market should be the only mechanism which works for adjustment. Now, I'm coming to the second part of my presentation. I will try to show you. I try to explain first what are the reasons for divergence, why it doesn't work. Now let's look at the data, and I'll show you that we have a big problem. In fact, today we can say that the Eurozone is in two parts, two distinct and very clearly separated parts. On one side, you have the mercantilist core country. This is how we call them in our paper, with Germany and what we call sometimes the German zone, in which you have Austria, in which you have the Netherlands, for instance, okay? And you have, these are the virtuous countries, the countries which are doing well, supposedly. In fact, it's not that simple, but they have low inflation, they have an undervalued currency within other countries because since they have less inflation, as I'll show you in a moment, their prices are lower, hence everything looks like as if they had an undervalued currency. Prices of German goods are lower than, for instance, the Spanish goods, okay? We have an export-led growth model, which is the one which is recommended officially, trade surpluses, small government deficit. So it's perfect in appearance. Except that if you look at the German model, you can see that this country, which is a very rich country, it's also a country where the level of inequality has been growing the fastest in the last 15 or 20 years. In other words, it's a country where you have a lot of poor workers, for instance, poor young people, but also poor old people. You have a lot of people in Germany who are retired, who have below the minimum level for poverty, okay? This is how Germany is working. When you look at Germany like that from the outside, it's a brilliant country, it's a very rich country, this is true, very efficient country, but on the social according to social standards, it's a country which is really in very deep trouble. Now, the peripheral countries, like Spain, Portugal, Greece, Italy, and France, I would say, also, to a large extent, well, they have a higher level of inflation, which means that they have a lower real rate of interest. You know what is a real rate of interest? It's a nominal rate of interest corrected for inflation. What does it mean in a country when you have a low rate of interest? You lend money very easily, okay? So in Spain, for instance, it's much more easy, and I'll show you figures in a moment, to get a loan. You're more motivated to get a loan to buy your house, or to buy a second house or a third house, even if you're not very rich, because the real interest rates are extremely low. Why are they very low? It's because we have a unique interest rate as a level of the Eurozone, unique nominal interest rate, but in fact, real interest rates are quite different from one country to the other because the level of inflation, in fact, are somewhat different. Okay, so we have a high debt. Households for instance, in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, have a high level of debt, which means that we have a consumption-led growth by opposition to the export-led growth that we had in Germany, for instance, or in Austria. Okay? So, of course, this is not very good for the trade balance because a lot of consumptions means a lot of imports, and a lot of imports means a trade deficit, of course. Okay? And this is why these countries are in trouble because they have large trade deficits, and also sometimes a government deficit is fairly important. So this is how Europe is today. These differences between one side, the mercantilist countries, and on the other side, the southern countries, the gap between these countries has been widening since the beginning of the Eurozone, that is since 1999. We have data, very eloquent data, I will show you in a moment. We show that we say that the Eurozone is a machine which creates inequalities and imbalances, growing inequalities and imbalances within the Eurozone. And this is the reason why we are in trouble. When you are in a zone where these inequalities and imbalances are growing, then you are in trouble. And the problem, I'll talk about that in a moment, is that the austerity policies and the economic policies which our governments are implementing now in Great Britain, even outside the Eurozone, but in France, in Germany, are in fact not reducing these inequalities, are increasing these inequalities and these imbalances. So this is why we are in real deep trouble. So here you can't see anything, I'm very sorry. So this is an incentive maybe for you to look at my PowerPoint presentation afterwards. But just to give you a few comments on this table, which is I think fairly interesting. Here, I show the two types of country. It doesn't work. So here in green, you have the virtuous country of the north, the mercantilist core country, Germany, Netherlands, Austria. Well, you will see when you look at the data, maybe some of you can see them, that these countries are, for instance, domestic demand growth, which is fairly low compared to, for instance, other countries. Look, for instance, Spain, from 1999, the beginning of the Eurozone, up to 2007, which is the year of the beginning of the crisis. You can see that in Spain, domestic demand was 4.6% a year, whereas in Germany, it was 0.7. Okay, when you see that, you understand that we had in two different worlds, in fact. One world is a world of slow growth, export-led model. The other world is a world of faster growth, but also consumption-led model. Okay, so this is quite different. Look at the real interest rates. Well, first, look at the inflation rate. We were supposed in Europe, and this was the goal of the ECB, to converge toward a common rate of inflation, which should have been around 2% a year. Okay? Look what happened from almost the 10 first years of the monetary union. Germany, less than 1%, 0.8% rate of inflation for each year on the average. Look, for instance, at Spain, 3.9% a year. On cumulate, if you cumulate these differences, year difference in terms of inflation, this is huge. It means, for instance, you have two consequences of this different level of inflation. One is that the real rate of interest is much lower in the southern countries. This is why households are borrowing much more, and you have a bubble, for instance, the housing bubble. Okay, but another reason also, result, which is not shown on the table, is that the competitiveness of southern countries where the rate of inflation is higher is becoming less and less important. Whereas in the northern country, when inflation is very low, you have an improvement year after year of the competitiveness. And look, this is the last column of this table, the current account balance, okay, the external balance if you prefer. All the northern countries have a very positive figure in terms of percentage of GDP. For instance, in Germany, the current account balance is 5% of GDP, okay, in 2011 at the end of the period. Whereas, look at Greece and Spain. Greece minus 7.8, Greece, Spain, I'm sorry, minus 2.9. So you can see by these figures that you have quite different countries, and these figures try to show that this gap is widening, has been widening since the beginning of the creation of the Eurozone, and this is why we are in deep trouble. Now, this is good for students in macroeconomic theory, let's say the second year. It's not a very high-level demonstration, but I think it's interesting. This is the macroeconomic balance, or if you prefer, imbalance. You have three major identities here. You have government expenditure minus taxation is a fiscal balance, okay? I, investment, and minus S is a private sector balance, household sector balance, difference between investment and savings, and M, imports minus X, export, is a trade or if you want, external balance, okay? We can see very well looking at the data, that, and I have some, next table is on that, but I won't spend too much time because it's too detailed, but you look at the table, you can see that all these balances, G minus T, I minus S, X minus M, has been widening, or at least have been changing in a very different way. For instance, core countries, if you look at the current account, have been doing fairly well, including during the crisis, the year of the crisis. Whereas, look, as we mentioned before, the non-core countries, the peripheral countries, have been having a higher external deficit. If you look now at the fiscal balance, you can see that the fiscal balance was not very good for core country because of the crisis, because of the slowdown of activity, but still was maintained at a fairly good level, minus 5% of GDP. Look what happened to the core countries, the non-core countries, 13% according to these measures. Now, what about the private sector balance? Well, you could see that until 2008, well, the non-core country had a negative situation. In other words, there were more investments in the household sector than savings. But due to austerity policies, the housings and the household sector had to go down, had to be reduced. This is why they came back to positive figures. So at the end of the period, we could say that the only point where we had a progress, convergence among European countries, the core and the non-core countries, was with respect to the private sector balance. Otherwise, with respect to external balance and with respect to the fiscal balance, the situation has been worsening all the time. And here I have a few diagrams, easier to interpret. For instance, what I was talking about, the fiscal private sector imbalance. Look what happened. Here you have the line below, underneath, which is the Northern Europe, you see, have a very favorable, fairly favorable balance, whereas countries, southern countries, the non-core countries, had a very high disequilibrium in the household sector, but you can see, as I was saying that previously, that the two groups of countries were converging. So this part of the situation is not so bad. But look now at what happened, for instance, in the current account sector, in the external sector. Here you have a growing divergence between northern countries with a surplus as a percentage of GDP, and southern countries with, of course, a growing deficit. Although this deficit has been stabilized at the end of the period, okay? But you see, it's a very symmetrical type of evolution, completely opposed. Of course, the deficits of one country, of a good country, is a surplus of the other group of countries. So this symmetry is quite understandable. The problem is that the discrepancies have been extremely important. And if you think in terms of external balances measured by assets, right, or by debts, you have, of course, the result is that northern countries have been accumulating external assets with respect to southern countries, which has been experiencing, of course, increasing external debt. And this is one of the problems that we have today, is to solve this type of problem of discrepancy. Now, if we want to wrap up a little bit what I've just been saying, for me, the major source of imbalances, and in particular external imbalances, which are really very important. By the way, economists sometimes present the Eurozone crisis as a sovereign debt crisis, which is the case to some extent. But for me, the major dimension of the Eurozone crisis is an external balance crisis. Okay? It's the fact that we have this huge divergence within the Eurozone due to this problem of lack of adjustment within the Eurozone. And why do we have such important divergence? Is because we have differences in terms of labor productivity and labor costs. Okay? I'll show you a graph for that in a moment. And also, I just said that a couple of times, but it is very important. In fact, we have two groups of countries, one with an export-led model for growth, and the other one is with a demand-led, domestic demand-led growth model, which are incoherent, in fact. We cannot be working well together. Okay? So, the idea is that one of the reasons of the problem in Europe is that the unit wage costs or unit labor costs are quite different. Okay? Where does this evolution come from? You have two variables, two evolutions which are very important, which are implicit here, is that the fact that we have labor productivity quite different from southern countries and northern countries, being much higher in northern countries. Why? It's because the level of education of workers is on the average higher, and also because the quality of equipment is on the average higher in northern Europe. And this is one reason. And the second reason is because inflation, hence nominal labor costs, are increasing much more in the southern countries than in the northern countries. And this is why you have this gap between labor costs, unit labor costs, from one zone to the other. And this is a problem. And typically France is here on this side. The countries where the labor cost is increasing more than respect to the core countries. This is why we have a big problem now in France with respect to external balance. Okay? So I don't want to be too long and too technical, but here you will see on the PowerPoint presentation, if you look at it in more detail, you will see that indeed the level of productivity, for instance, is quite different. Here this is the level of productivity of northern countries, or if you want core countries, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Australia. You can see that the rate of growth for labor productivity is much higher, okay, much higher than countries like France, Italy, Spain, where the rate of growth is lower. So here we have a big problem in terms of productivity of labor. And there is a big debate in Europe, of course, with respect to that, because it is very, very important. This is one of my PhD students who writing a dissertation on this question, gave me these graphs. They show very clearly also, so this is unit labor cost, ULC. Look at Austria from the 80s up to 2010, we have a negative slope here, okay? Look, for instance, at France. France is on the good side according to her measures, which was surprising. Germany is very interesting. From the 80s up to the 95, situation in Germany was not so good. And we had the Schroeder government measures, which was very constraining on the level on wages. Look, Germany suddenly, from 95 up to now, improved its situation. This is why now Germany is doing so well. Italy, if you compare the other countries, southern countries like Italy, Portugal, Spain, you can see that basically we have a very clearly positive slope for unit labor costs. So one of the major problems we have in Europe now, and why the Eurozone doesn't work very well, is because it's not because we have differences. It's normal to have different countries having different rate of growth of productivity. The problem is that we don't have other adjustment variable to take care of these differences. In the past, we had exchange rate adjustment between the countries. When a country like Spain, for instance, or Italy had a problem of competitiveness because its labor cost was higher than Germany or France, there was a devaluation of the peseta with respect to French franc or the German Deutschmark. But not today, it's not possible anymore because we have a unique currency. So we need other mechanism of adjustment. According to neoliberal economists, the adjustment should take place through the other prices on the market, that is the price of goods and services, and the wages themselves. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And since we don't have also fiscal transfer from one region to the other, for the reason I mentioned before, we are in a system where we have no ways of adjusting differences between countries, and this is why this system doesn't work. Okay? Now, as I was mentioning before, for most economists, I'm sure that if you read papers or if you listen to the radio and the media, most commentators were talking about the government debt crisis as a major dimension of the Eurozone crisis. Of course, this was important when the Greek crisis happened in 2009. That was a real problem because we have a lot of speculation and we had a lot of problem of banks being in troubles and so on. But for us, this was only one aspect of the crisis. Okay? The major aspect is a problem of internal contradiction, which led to growing imbalances between countries with respect to the trade account or the current account. So we can see that the subprime crisis, for instance, which started in the US and then came to other parts of the world. It came to Brazil, but it came also to Europe. It was in fact what we call an asymmetrical shock, in the sense that the different countries of the Eurozone did not answer in the same manner to this external shock. Okay? Countries like Germany and the Netherlands did fairly well. They did not have strong government deficits. They did not have major problem with their banking system. Whereas Spain, for instance, or Ireland, Portugal, were really in deep trouble. And of course, Greece. So here we have a problem of strongest heterogeneity and asymmetric shock, which were very important. And also, my belief, is that the way the crisis was managed by the governments, and in particular the German government, which takes in fact the decision for the rest of the Union, was terrible. It was the worst possible one. First, we had a lack of political solidarity between the countries. The German government said, we don't want to pay for the Greek, okay? And also, the European institutions were not adapted to deal with the crisis. Why? For instance, we have no common budget. So the European Commission couldn't do anything eventually to help some country which were in trouble because we had no money to do for that. No public funds, no transfers possible from one country to the other or from the European level to countries which were in trouble. So this is why this crisis, sovereign debt crisis, was so important. Another thing which I would like to mention, which is in our paper with Robert Gutmann also, is that here we had a very paradoxical situation with respect to the public deficit, public government deficits. Before the crisis, most countries in Europe had a lower deficit and public debt, government debt, than the UK, which is not, as you know, in the Eurozone, or the US, or Japan, for instance. And in fact, in 2010, 3 years after the beginning of the crisis, the level of public deficit, government deficit, was much lower in Europe. 6.3% of GDP in the Eurozone, compared to 10% in the UK, 11% in the US. But these two countries, UK and the US, did better than we did in terms of exiting the crisis, in terms of managing the crisis, because they were outside the Eurozone, and also they were not constrained by the rules, the very stringent rule within the Eurozone, which were a big problem. Look at a country like Ireland. Ireland really was in maybe the worst situation. This country had a government surplus before the crisis and had a minus 32% deficit, okay, in 2010. Why? Because the government had to rescue banks which were in deep trouble and had which had very important losses. So this country, in fact, had a very high level of debt only because of the question of the banking system, which was not completely working completely well. Remember yesterday, in my conference, I mentioned the idea that we had a twin crisis within the Eurozone, saying that by the word of twin crisis, we had at the same time a crisis on the banking system related to a crisis of the sovereign debt, okay? In the sense that big losses by banks created government deficit because the government had to rescue the banks. But at the same time, the banks are holding a large part of government bonds, and if government deficit is going higher, the value of debt is declining, hence banks are experiencing losses. So you have a vicious circle. And this was part of the process, in particular in a country like Ireland, which was in big trouble due to the working of the system. Okay? I'm going to go a little bit faster. Oh, if you look at the PowerPoint presentation, here it's too small, but you'll see the type of rescue plans, in other words, austerity measures or adjustment measures which were imposed to the countries which had the deepest problem. That is Greece, Ireland, and Portugal. And you'll see how harsh these measures were. And this is why in Greece, for instance, today you have a lot of poverty, inequality. The health system is completely destroyed, to a large extent destroyed, and so on. So this is to show you that this European crisis and the austerity measure which had to be taken afterwards are very dramatic. Another dimension of the drama in Europe, I mentioned that before, but I want to stress that again, is the question of the unemployment rate. Look at this diagram, this graph, which is, according to me, very spectacular. Look at what happened to the unemployment rate since the beginning of the crisis, 2008, if you want. The northern countries had a declining rate of unemployment, okay? Whereas the southern countries have a higher and increasing rate of unemployment. According to me, this is part of the incoherent system that we have. In the sense that the way the Eurozone is working is such that the northern countries are exporting unemployment toward the southern countries. Why? Because southern countries cannot adjust to the fact that they have a higher rate of inflation, higher unit labor cost, hence the competitiveness is not as good. And since they don't have exchange rate, no other variables to adjust, the situation is such that in fact, one of the adjustment variables, in fact, is the unemployment rate, okay, which is fairly improving in the northern countries, but which is worsening in southern countries. And this is one of the drama for Europe, because you can understand that at least you have two major consequences. First, for the young people in particular, you destroy completely a generation of workers there. Look at Spain, when you have 50% of the young people who have no unemployment, they go abroad if they have the diploma, because, for instance, if they want to come to Brazil, I'm sure that you will not accept unqualified worker. You will take, of course, qualified worker. So the workers who are not so well qualified, they are in deep trouble. What do they do? It's a loss, a whole generation which is lost for the economy and for the Spanish society. This is one consequence. The second consequence, how can you imagine that the people, the new generation, be in favor of Europe in such a situation? You have so many people who are suffering from this situation and realize that the European system doesn't work on the basis of solidarity, but works, on the contrary, on the basis of competition and austerity. Well, they reject Europe. And this is very dangerous for the future of Europe. Okay? So if you think, like I do, that the European idea is a very important idea and we have to go on building Europe, and you have young people, and I can understand them very well, well, this is what's happening. You have young people who are protesting, and you can understand that, and rejecting Europe. But they are more clever than I was afraid that they would reject bluntly Europe. In fact, if you look at what young people say in Europe, in Spain or in Greece, in fact, they are basically in favor of Europe, but they want a refoundation of Europe. They want Europe built on. For me, today, as we stand today, we have three major scenarios possible in the future. Okay? One, which is what I would call the catastrophic scenario, where we have an implosion of the Eurozone. In other words, countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal, who are suffering a lot from austerity policies, high level of unemployment, decide to get out of the Eurozone. Okay? Then we have a disintegration of the Eurozone. But according to me, this disintegration would go much further than the Eurozone. There would be a risk with respect to other elements of the European construction, and this would create tensions, economic but also political tensions among European countries. This is where it is very dangerous. But this scenario, although a lot of people today are very confident, which was not the case 3 years ago, they are very confident that say, no, it's over, the crisis is over, there won't be any implosion of the Eurozone. Well, I don't think so. I think this scenario is still possible. Now, the second scenario, which is what's happening now for the time being, we called it, in our paper with Robert Gutmann, a muddling through scenario. In other words, we have a crisis which is going to be long, very painful, without any implosion of the Eurozone, but with a risk of recession and even deflation. And now we are talking about a risk of deflation, as you know, in Europe. And this is what was called in Japan, for instance, where they have, for other reasons, a problem like that, is what they call the lost decade. In other words, the crisis started in 2009 in Europe. You could very well think that it could last until 2019. This is quite possible if this scenario is going on, which means if the governments, if the elites of Europe decide to maintain the system as it is today. Okay? And the third scenario, which is the optimistic one, but unfortunately the least likely, is the idea that we succeed in making radical reforms. Okay? In other words, we have a budget, we have fiscal policies in Europe, we have, let's say, broadly speaking, Keynesian policies implemented in Europe, among other things, and then we can succeed or we can get out of the crisis in better conditions. But for the time being, I'm afraid this scenario is not very likely, okay? So, in fact, this means that to a large extent, the future of the Eurozone is very uncertain. Mr. Mario Draghi, who is the most powerful person maybe in Europe now, in the Eurozone, even more maybe than Angela Merkel, or at least let's say that Europe is governed by two persons now, Angela Merkel on one side, Mario Draghi from the other side. And they don't agree on all, by the way. This is interesting. Well, Mr. Draghi said 2 years ago, it was in July 2012, I'll do anything I can to save the euro. And since the markets are so powerful in Europe, as they are also in Brazil, by the way, this gave back confidence to the markets. And now people in the media and the markets, and as you know, the markets are the more important than our own opinion, okay? The market think that, well, the crisis is over since Mr. Draghi will take care of the problem if there is a problem, okay? This is where we stand today. But in fact, it seems to me that if we maintain the austerity policy and if we don't create new adjustment mechanisms within the Eurozone, it is likely that the implosion scheme takes place, that one or two countries gets out. By the way, I have some of my colleagues who are working on scenario of disaggregation of the Eurozone. One of them is the following. Is the idea to replace the euro, which is a single currency, by what we may call a common currency. In other words, the euro would be still there, the ECB will be still there, but countries will go back and get back their national currencies. The French franc, the German Deutschmark, the Spanish peseta, and so on will come again, and there would be an exchange rate to manage between the common currency and the national currency, which means that adjustments, devaluation could take place within countries, between countries, devaluation or revaluation, and the euro will be only a common currency with respect, which will play a role with respect to external countries, countries outside the Eurozone, with respect to the dollar, for instance, okay? And this is, on the paper, very interesting. I'm afraid that it is very unrealistic in terms of institutional matter, okay? Very difficult to build. But why not? The role of economists, I think, today is to think of situations or solutions where we can get out of this very difficult crisis, and this is one of them. This is one of the situations. So we are working very much on which policy should be implemented, which alternative policies should be implemented to get out of this crisis. To conclude, so in fact, for me, there is a great uncertainty as to the future of the euro. Okay, I do believe that if we don't change the rules as they are today, maybe not tomorrow, but in the near future, some years, we may have an implosion, or we may have not only a monetary implosion, but a political implosion. And the risk we have now in Europe is to see nationalist parties, political parties in Germany, in France, in Spain, and so on, take over. And then this would be very dangerous, not only for the people in the country, but also for Europe, which was built, I recall, to bring peace and to have peaceful relationships between the country. If we have nationalist governments in the most important countries, this may create serious political problems. Okay, so in fact, I think that economic theory and ideology has a very important responsibility in the Eurozone crisis. It's because we used a theoretical framework which is completely inadapted, that is a monetarist framework in particular, that we are in deep trouble today. And this shows you how theory can be important, sometimes in positive side, but also in the negative side. In other words, the elite in Europe, the one who are at the central bank, the one who are working at the European Commission, are completely dominated by neoliberal and monetarist views. And one of the challenges for us, for heterodox economists, but who are such a tiny minority that it is very difficult, is to have them change their mind. Because if they don't change their mind, then we'll stay in trouble. In other words, the euro crisis is also an intellectual, a theoretical crisis to some extent. In other words, it shows, this is why I put in the title of my presentation, the failure of theories, neoliberal theories. I think the theory here, theoreticians have a part of responsibility in the euro crisis. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for your presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned several times the importance of adjustment mechanisms to solve the problem, and you mentioned the possibility of a common currency with inflation, exchange rates fluctuating for domestically. You said it's very difficult to think about this politically now, but if we just put this aside, I was wondering, what do you think about Keynes' Bancor proposal? Because he talked about this idea of a common currency, but he went further, proposing also the taxing of countries with surplus, which will provide net transfers to companies with deficit. That's my question.
Okay. That's a very good question. In fact, I would say two things about that. This Keynesian solution would be the best. Because although it is very ambitious, it is to a large extent more realistic than the one I mentioned, the common currency. And it is more realistic because it already existed. In fact, in Europe, before the Eurozone, in the 1950s, we had what we call in French, l'Union Européenne des Paiements, European System of Payments, which was built on the model of the Keynesian. People don't know about that, but the Keynesian model, it existed already, has been implemented in a regional setting, which is l'Union Européenne des Paiements. In other words, just after the war, in the framework of the Marshall Plan, US was giving funds to the European economies. One way to rebuild Europe, which was devastated by war, is to build a new system of payment between the country. And the idea that it was built on the model of the Bancor and the clearing union model by Keynes. Okay? And one idea which is very important in this system is that there is a symmetrical treatment of creditor and debitor country. And here today in Europe, if we had such a treatment, that would change a lot of the things, because Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, they don't care about the problem of Europe because they think it's not their problem, they think it's the problem of the countries. Whereas if you say deficit countries are as much responsible as surplus countries in terms of adjustment, then you create a new dynamic, a new political situation, and then you would improve the situation. So, yes, the Bancor and clearing union solution proposed by Keynes is completely adapted to the situation. Why I did not mention it is because it's surprising. It was not proposed by many economists so far. We tried to do it, a couple of us. One who did that, maybe the most well-known economist in Europe who did that, is an Italian economist, He wrote very good papers. It's called Luca Fantacci. And if you want to invite him, he'd be delighted to come, I'm sure. We invited him, by the way, and he wrote very good papers on this question, Fantacci. And he's really, I think he's right. His presentation, his proposal are right.
Professor, I'd like to know, in your opinion, what are the risks of the ultra-radical right parties in Europe, like Front National in France, and in Greece. There's some right parties in yes, and in terms of political and economic of the success of the European Union.
We take another question, or what do you prefer? We take another question, one by.
So, as I mentioned before, in all countries in Europe now, in Greece, in France, in Germany, and so on, you have nationalists and, to some extent, extreme right parties which are rising in the elections. You can understand that. I don't excuse them because I hate their ideology, but you can understand that they are successful because people are completely lost now. They have this European construction which is in trouble. You don't see that the policies which are implemented are improving the situation. So people look elsewhere. They look at proposals, so-called alternative proposals by this type of political party. So what are the proposals? Well, the proposal is to exit the euro, of course. Even for some of them exit the European Union, which is not the case in France. In France, they want to exit the Eurozone, but not the European Union. So it depends from one country to the other. And the idea also is to introduce control at the border for goods, services, and capital. Okay, protectionism, if you want, and to implement very strong national policies in terms of economics, but also migration, immigration, and so on. Okay, so since they are very strong policy, very easy to understand, simplistic policies, in fact, that people like that. Okay, they think it's the solution. Okay, so fortunately, in most countries, including France, where France they get approximately 20% of the vote, and maybe the next election is going to be much more, but they are very far from the majority. But still, they win. In Greece, it's even more extreme right. It's fascist, completely. It's a fascist type of party, very dangerous. They hit people, they kill people. They are very... in France, it's not the case so far. So, in fact, the problem is that it is very difficult for us to demonstrate that the policies are inefficient. Because for most people, yes, euro doesn't work. Let's exit. It's a simple answer. We have too many external workers, foreign workers, and we have a high level of unemployment. Yes, the solution is easy. Let's get rid of the foreign workers because then we will have employment and so on. But of course, as you know, when you look more deeply in this proposal, they are not coherent and they are not serious. But still, they are very attractive to many people who are in trouble and are lost. They need some references. So I think our responsibility for us, heterodox economists, is to try to show that there are alternative policies which are realistic in the sense they can be implemented now and which would bring progress, social progress in particular. But this is very difficult because we have against us the media in most countries, in Spain, in France, in Germany, and so on. Heterodox economists, it's very difficult for us to be heard by the public opinion because when we say something, when we write a paper, when we send a paper to a newspaper, they don't publish it usually. Okay, so it's very, very difficult, but still we have to present things. So, for instance, the Bancor proposal by Keynes, since it's been proposed proposed a long time ago, since it's known by a good number of people. That's a type of proposal which may be very interesting to present. And so it is difficult today when you are an economist, critical economist with respect to Europe, to say, yes, this Europe doesn't work, but no, we should not exit from the Eurozone today. Because the risk of exiting the Eurozone are greater than the benefits that we could have. This is very difficult. Most people don't understand that, don't believe you, trust you.
Professor Plihon, nice to see you again. I'd like to ask you about Germany. I think that the central point of this mess is Germany, yes. When we saw in 1990 the movement of reintegration of Germany, well, we just could think, well, Germany is built again and power strategy for the 21st century, yeah? But today, I really don't know. I really don't know if Germany has, in fact, in what is this power strategy. I'd like to listen to you. Do you think that there is a power strategy for Germany, and what is this strategy? Thank you.
Going the same direction, when you said at the beginning of your presentation about the biases of the Eurozone, you said that there is a mercantilist bias. I was just wondering if it's due to the architecture of the Eurozone itself, or if it is a national non-cooperative strategy of Germany. I mean, is it their fault, or both? Maybe, I don't know.
Can I? Well, my question is complementary to his question, but on the other way, I see that there is also a rise of the left in these countries, like in Greece, of Syriza's party and so on. So I'd like to know, I'd like for you to comment on the left alternative to go beyond the euro crisis in these countries.
So the first question about Germany and reunification is very important. I would put it in a different way you presented it. I'm astounded by the fact, by the way, I have, as all of you, if we are critical of Germany, it doesn't mean that we are anti-German, of course, because I have many German friends among heterodox economists, by the way, attack network and so on. So it's not an attack on German people, it's an attack on German government as it is today, which is very important to say. Now, the German governments in the previous years are completely incoherent. I try to explain because it's not that easy to explain. When there was this reunification business in 1989 and the following years, the German, working as a monetary union, said to new lenders, come please, and we'll help you, and we'll use the money, our common currency, with a very interesting exchange rate, to help you to integrate Germany. And second, we'll make transfers, huge transfer, fiscal transfer from West Germany to East Germany, which is now the same country. So this country was doing a very good job at that time. And it was, by the way, a right-wing government, Mr. Kohl, Chancellor Kohl. So it was not a progressive government. They did a very, very, very good job. So now my question is that why don't they want us to implement the same policies, that is to transfer fiscal resources from one part to the other, and to use the monetary union as the way to help or to reindustrialize some part of the European countries like southern country, like in Portugal, in Greece. So they are very incoherent. Of course, the explanation is unfortunately very simple, is that it's a very nationalistic approach. For me, Mrs. Merkel and the previous governments are not European people. Just, they don't think in European terms. They think in German terms, in nationalistic terms. That's a problem. And in Europe now, we have many governments, not only the German government, the Austrian government, Hungarian government, of course. We are very nationalistic, and they don't think in European terms. So this is why they are not in the 21st century. If you admit the 21st century, as I mentioned yesterday, maybe or should be a century of regionalization, of regional unions, Europe being one of them, but Latin America being another one, Asia being another one, Africa, and so on. So, in fact, we have a very regressive government in Germany. They don't have a vision of the future, and that's a problem. And the other problem is that our governments, that is the French government, the Italian government, the Spanish government, also do not have a vision, because if they had such a vision, they would get together, although some are left government, others are conservative government, but they would get together and say to Germany, look, your policy is not the right one for Europe. It's very dangerous for the future of Europe. We have to change the rules. We have to be more have more solidarity, cooperation, to have transfer from one part of Europe to the other, and so on. And my government, for instance, the French government, is very weak, not only because Mr. Hollande is very low in the polls, but also because he has no idea, no vision. Contrary to previous governments like Chancelier Kohl, for instance, in Germany, or François Mitterrand in France, of course, De Gaulle, to some extent, to a large extent also after the war, because De Gaulle fought the German, but he was one of the architects of the unification. So he had a vision, which is today not the case. And this is why, going to this mercantilist view, I think these people, Merkel, Schäuble, and others, are mercantilist people because they are only interested in having trade surplus, and they don't see that that's not enough to build Europe and to have their people happy, to improve the welfare of people. So they have a very narrow approach to what's the role of politics, okay? And that's the big problem. So to go on with this question of the bias, it seems to me that the monetarists and neoliberal bias in Germany is linked to their history and to the fact that they have a vision of order, of neoliberal order. We call that ordoliberalism, which is the idea that liberalism should be the rule, markets should play the role of adjustment, but we don't trust, and we don't trust government. We have to impose them rules, like the golden rule with respect to government deficit, no more than 1% deficit, for instance, or with respect to inflation, no more than 2% of inflation, no matter what happens. So this is very dangerous, and behind that there is the idea that we cannot trust our government. We have to impose them rules because they are not trustable, okay? We can excuse to some extent the German people because their history has been dramatic, okay? They have been suffering a lot from the war and from the fascist government. So I can understand that some people want to avoid giving too much power to governments. You can understand that. But still, today, we are in the 21st century. Public and government policies should play a role again. Because we are in trouble, because we have huge challenges like, for instance, the energy transition, the problem of energy, which is so important, the problem of climate, which is so important. And if we don't have strong common policies in Europe, Europe has no role to play in the future, okay? And these people, Merkel, but also Hollande and Renzi and all these people, finally, are not really not very interesting political leaders. They have no visions of the future. So it is our role as economists, as citizens, where we are to try to organize a debate, to have maybe a change in the public opinion, to have a change also in government, but for the time being, it is extremely difficult. Third question about Syriza. Yes, you're right. The Syriza movement, the Syriza party, which is a coalition of a good number of smallest parties, is a very, very interesting and very, it gives you some optimistic vision of the future of Europe. Because these are radical people, but also realistic people. And do I say that they are radical and realistic? They are radical because they want to change the policies in Europe, but they want to stay in the Eurozone. So they've realized, and I think they are very clever, that if the Greece get out of Eurozone, they'll be much worse off than if they stay in the Eurozone. But at the condition that the policies are changed. One way to change policies when you are such a small country as Greece, the political power and the political weight is so weak, so small, is to organize resistance and to decide to disobey to the treaty. And this is my position. If I had someday to have a political position in my country, this is what I would do. I would say, okay, I disagree with the rules, like de Gaulle did, by the way, saying, we refuse the rule, we won't implement them, they are bad rules. It doesn't mean that I become a nationalist. It means that we think that the rules are bad, we have to change them, and we try to make alliances with other countries or other movements we think the same. And this may be the future of Europe, maybe. This is one way to change Europe. Syriza may get elected in the next elections. Unfortunately, it's going to be a minority government, so they will have to make alliances with more conservative governments, so it's going to be very tricky for them. But since they are fairly smart and fairly mature people, maybe this will be very interesting. So yes, Syriza is a very interesting thing, a very interesting party, and I really hope that they win the election, and this may change things in Europe to some extent. Whereas in Spain also you have something which is very interesting. You have this new party called Podemos, which is a very radical party, but they have interesting views on Europe. They don't want to get out of Europe. They want to build Europe on other bases. So if you look at these two countries of Southern Europe, Greece and Spain, well, you can see that there are some progress on the political scene, but also on the ideological scene. But this, so far, it's very small compared to the power of the big countries and the big business, also big financial system. So it's not, it won't be that easy.
So, Professor Plihon, in the name of all of us, I'd like to thank you very much again for the week spent here. We know you're very busy, and it was a great honor for us to have you here this whole week. For those of you who want to meet him tomorrow, he's going to be here. You just have to write me, and we can arrange it. And then he's leaving on Saturday. Okay. So, thank you very much. It was great for us.